Hello everybody and welcome to another IAPC&M CPD and Business Building webinar. My name's Dawn Campbell, I'm your host, and this is number 9 of the complimentary CPD series that will help you prepare and feel more confident when you take your IAPC&M assessment call to achieve your professional status. As usual, I'm joined with David Monroe-Jones, and we're just going to have a general discussion around what it means to help our clients consider options. So from an assessment point of view, hello David, from an assessment point of view, what is it that you and your team of assessors are looking for out of this series of capabilities, please?
Well, out of the entire series, what we're looking for is essentially, can you do what it says on the tin? Mm-hmm. So can you coach? So all of the different capability areas, although they stand separate in their own right, they're all linked to the coaching calls or the coaching assessment. So what you generally find is that if you don't do one area, or you don't do one area well, then it can have repercussions on others. So a good coaching call, quite simply, starts well, continues well, and ends well. And it means that when you go to the actual assessment itself and you start allocating the scores, you can look at the coaching call holistically, as a whole, and within that, think did they start well? Did they do the contracting? All of the capability areas that we've looked at so far. Did the conversation, the coaching call, whatever word you want to use it, did it flow? Did it follow a natural sequence? Was it beneficial for the client? Did it end well? Did the client know that they had actions? Have they agreed to those? Were those actions related to what the overall goal was, and so on and so forth? And I know the last two capability areas, when we start talking about action planning and managing progress and accountability, link very much to what we're going to be talking about today. But what you generally find is that if one of those sections is missing, or if one of those sections capability areas tends to be weaker than another, it instinctively just has a knock-on effect. So if we look back to the questioning part or the listening part, if you don't ask a relevant question, or you miss a relevant question, or you don't listen to more than what the client says, you don't pick up on something that's going on underneath, then when you get to some of the other areas, you're working with information that you've got, but information that you've got that isn't necessarily accurate.
Okay.
So it all comes together like a nice ball of wool.
Yeah, and I actually think this is the most exciting part of the call, accepting that action planning and managing the accountability is one of the key factors. People go to coaching and pay for coaching, and we'll come on to those in number 10 and 11. But I think exploring the options is where you get really creative, and also the coach, can relax and show their energy and enthusiasm and really help the client tap into their creativity. But it's something that you need to set up properly. I mean, if we look at the T-GROW model, which is one of the most popular models out there, we don't just go into each of the sections. It is led up to quite nicely, and I use T-GROW. So for me, when I'm in reality, before I get into options, I really want to concentrate on getting my client out of pain motivation and into pleasure motivation. And I think it's kind of a given, isn't it, David, that all our clients are in some sort of pain, otherwise they wouldn't come to coaching in the first place.
It's I would totally agree with that.
Yeah. So I think my job in the R section of T-GROW is to explore the reality. When was the last time they were good at X? Whatever the topic is, we'll try and find some sort of common ground that makes them think, oh yeah, actually I was good at that before, I can be good at it again. And because you've done all those other preceding steps and you've laid the groundwork, you can personalize your questions. So, you know, in goal, you said, when would you like this addressed by? So that means that, you know, we can end reality with, so fast forward to spring of 2021, when you said you wanted to look, you know, fabulous in wedding photographs. What are some of the things that will be happening? If they're visual, you can say, what can you see, and so on, and they'll describe that. Once they've articulated out loud exactly what their goal is, what they are seeing or hearing or feeling, depending on their VHF, that's when you take them into options. It's like, bang, right, now we're here. What if you could do anything at all? What would be the very first step? Forget logic, fear of failure, risk of embarrassment, finances. What would be the very first thing you would like to do? And so you're in options. So that's the way I present it. And I feel my whole sort of physiology and my energy is very different at this stage of the coaching session. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at, you know, sort of the definition that we use within sort of the capability area. So considering options is very much about the ability to support the client in exploring options that will maximize opportunities for ongoing learning and progress, you know, like on the desired outcome. So before we get into the, you know, sort of, well, what does that mean? Just considering the definition, you know, like in the key words there, you know, the ability to support the client. So this isn't, you know, as you say, you know, this isn't about the coach saying, well, you know, like, okay, based on what you've said, here's a lot of options. And the sort of the sidebar there is almost the, you know, and there's a key distinction between what a mentor might do and, you know, what a consultant probably would do. You know, but with a coach, it's very much, you know, like the supporting bit, helping the client in exploring, you know, the options. And the other key word in there is, you're like, you know, is maximize opportunities. You know, it's not just about, well, what could you do? Oh, I could do that. Oh, well, fair enough. Then you're like, that's that. Yeah, like, let's move on, just do that and let's get on with it. It's about looking at that. And this is where, you know, when we were talking in the previous one, you know, so like about, you know, creating awareness through feedback and challenge. You know, this is where, you know, like challenge starts to, you know, like continue through, because when you get up to, you know, like the considering options bit, you know, without being sort of cruel, blunt and straight to the point too much, if you haven't done numbers 1 to 7 correctly, number 8 is going to fall over, because, you know, they won't have enough options in their own head. You know, they won't have explored the reality, as you were talking about, in enough detail to recognize the different things that they could do. And I'm not saying that, you know, when you get to the options, and you might, you know, just ask a very open question of, you're like, okay, so based on what we've talked about, yeah, what options do you have? And yeah, they come out with this myriad that's hard to keep up with. They might only come out with 2 or 3, but those 2 or 3 might be absolutely, you know, spot on and critical. I was thinking of it, so I was thinking about this today whilst I was fretting about other things, and the expression, it's an expression I don't use very often, but I hear the Americans use it quite often. You know, this is where the rubber meets the road. Of right, okay, you're like, it's essentially saying, right, you're like, you've talked about, you know, like what the issue is in a great amount of depth. We're now stepping across into, so, you know, what are you going to do about it then? You know, that is the, you know, that is, you know, for me, so like, is this the step over bit. And it's the, so like, so you've got the maximize bit, and then you've got the, you know, for ongoing learning, and then, you know, the key, the absolute key bit, progress on the desired outcome. And that links directly back to, you know, as you were calling, so like the T and the, you know, so the T for topic, G for grow bit, of if you haven't correctly identified right up front what the real issue is, not necessarily what they say the topic is, but you're like, what the real issue that the client needs to work on is, when you get to these options, you know, they can be just superficial. So that bit right up the front around, you know, like, you know, what is it you want to work on? What is it about this that's important now? You're like, what's the impact of doing nothing? what's the drive? What's your commitment towards this? Like, who's driving this? Who's responsible for getting this done? If you didn't do it in 6 months' time, what would your life be like? So you've got that right up front of what, now that we've talked about all of that, I have definitely got to get this sorted. So that drive, when you go through the rest of the questions, the reality, all of that exploration, it is heading now towards this end point. And you can look at it almost like a funnel, that we've done all of the wide part, and we're now really coming into the the neck of the funnel, because the options are going to lead into the the actions and accountability. But that challenge bit, when people start talking about their options, it's that ability to reflect back and go, okay, within those options, about to what degree does that option actually help you to achieve or progress towards your desired outcome. So it's not just a case of letting them come out with these options. And similarly to what you're saying about the energy level, I think so. Certainly, when I've been coaching, and you get to this point, it's easier within Tegro, because when options are coming. If you're using another model, the options are still there. They just come in some cases in a different way. Mm-hmm. But as soon as the client starts going through their options, and you're reading the energy level, so it's not just I suppose I could probably do that. Mm. But they're going, this is great. These are the things I need to do. These are the things that I could do. This is what I can do. And everything that they're coming out with, you're supporting with additional questions or additional challenge or additional feedback, to really get them, to progress towards this desired outcome. Even if they don't achieve it, which in some coaching sessions, they're not going to achieve. Just picking on your comment about I want to look good in the wedding dress, they're probably not going to do that in the first hour. But if at the end of that first hour, they've got that impetus and that drive and that this is good, these are the things that that I can do. These are the things that I'm going to go on and do. Sidebar to be continued in the last couple of sessions, our sessions, that is. That they've just got that. Because the worst case scenario is when you get to options, you go, okay, so what could you do? Don't know. Mm-hmm. It just falls completely flat. So you're absolutely right. This is the part where you're really engaging with the client around fully exploring. And I can't emphasize this enough, and it's important certainly for practitioner coaches, and gets slightly more important so as you move from there to senior to master to fellow. But this the key word that you engage the client and you fully explore alternatives, possibilities, in choices, and to evaluate the options. Mm-hmm. And help the client work through that. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I think that is important to mention, before we really start getting into the meat of this, is that if you were using Tegro, and you've only the assessment course for practitioners 30 minutes, then you need to think about how much time, not necessarily to the minute, and say we've covered that, it's time to move on, because it needs to have a natural flow. But to give correct weighting to how much time you're spending on the topic, the goal, the reality, the option, so in the way forward. And there is a danger sometimes to think that if I've spent a lot of time in the reality bit, the options will just will just fall out. Mm-hmm. And that's partly correct, certainly from the assessments, but it's not the whole story. So you need to allow enough time to explore the options and coax, if necessary, and cajole and challenge the client to come up with other stuff. And certainly on other webinars we've had that the statement that always sticks in my mind. It's not about asking the client the question that they know the answer to. It's asking the client the question that they don't know the answer to.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to options, it's pushing them for that as well too. I'm hesitant to say think outside the box because it's not one of my favorite expressions, but it's to look at it from other perspectives.
Yeah. Okay, that was really useful.
Sorry, I went off on a you energized me so much this with your preamble that I felt that just went off on one. I do apologize.
No, that's fine. I think just going back to the T-GROW model for the benefits of the practitioners who are using that, because it was a popular question around, well, how long do I spend in each section? I tended to think of it as, 2 minutes introduction, gauging the energy, the topic, 3 or 4 minutes in goal, really getting clear about what the goal is, 3 or 4 or 5 minutes in reality, when was the last time they were good at this, making them feel good about themselves and getting them into pleasure motivation, and a good 15 minutes, maybe slightly more in options, and then the last 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes, depending on how long you need to take, and it's a hypothetical judgment call for every client in that wrap up. Obviously, if you've got somebody who's very monosyllabic, you could be wrapped up in 2 minutes. But if there was a lot of exciting options and you really need to nail down, that's your last opportunity. But that's just roughly for those practitioners who are listening who, have that question, which is a really popular one. So going back to the exploring the options, this is where I'm sensing from what you were saying that mirroring back in really clean language, reflecting and getting the client to rephrase anything that's not serving them is actually a really important part of this section.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And it does happen, if somebody is giving superficial answers, or they're quite monosyllabic, or indeed they're stuck, how would you advise practitioners to deal with that in a way that isn't interrogational, which the what question tends to be? So what could you do? What would you do next? How would you deal with it, David, please?
I think the way that you can deal with this depends a little bit on the client that you're dealing with, because there can be people who are monosyllabic for a number of different reasons. So if the topic is something that is really important that they're struggling with, they might be monosyllabic, simply because they just don't know what to do. But on the other hand, you might have somebody who is just naturally just yes, no. And I think that one of the things that you can do is to encourage people to look at things from different perspectives. And you can remove what simply by sticking the word if in front of it. So if your neighbor, if your friend came up with a similar question, how would that conversation unfold? If you went to your neighbor, if you went to your friend, if an alien from space came down, and you had that conversation, how would they deal with the issue? What things might they suggest? And the thing about options is, and the thing about the what question is that, unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be, what tends to lend itself to everything. And as I've said to a number of people, if you break the questions, if you look at them beyond the the 5WH, that when you look at a specific topic, so going to a supermarket, for example, and you start breaking that down into if you go into a supermarket, if you pardon the double use of this, what would you use what for? When you might say, what are you going to the supermarket for? And then you've got when are you going? How are you going to get there? Which items are you going to buy? And things like that. That when you're using what, it has a specific reference. It gets a different type of answer than something else. So to avoid the interrogation bit is very much about listening to the the tone of voice of the person that you're working with. And if you sense that somebody is struggling and just generally doesn't know, then talk to them about that. Just say, okay, I'm sensing that you're struggling with this. In what areas are you struggling? Or in another way, you might say, what is it about this question that you find difficult to answer? And just get into it with them. Because if you don't, and you just try and keep rephrasing questions, all you're doing is sort of adding additional questions to the unanswered question. And you can ask questions such as, if I could ask you a question now that would really help you to open up, and think in different ways, or feel in different ways, or consider this in a different way. Which question would that be? Or or what question would that be? Or what would it be? If the roles were reversed, what would you ask me? And that that can certainly help people to start opening up.
I mean, if you've got a client who's monosyllabic for whatever reason, that just shows the coaches the importance of asking open questions, so that you don't allow them the opportunity just to say yes, no, yes, no. So I think that's really worth remembering, particularly for newbie practitioners, to take the pressure off yourself. If you stick to open questions, you will have a better quality conversation, even if the client says, I don't know. It's better than a no, because this is a section that a lot of new practitioners are worried about. They hear what the topic is and they go into freeze mode. Oh my God, I've never coached somebody on time management or weight loss or running a business or writing a book or whatever it is. It's not my area of expertise. And so they don't really enjoy the options section because they don't know what to ask. But if you've done all the preparation, as you say, all the other steps in advance, and you stick to open questions, it should be a really enjoyable section for both of you. But when somebody, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so there's a flip side to that as well. And the flip side is, if you know the topic extremely well. Because if you know the topic extremely well, when the client gets to options, no matter how good you are in your own head, your brain will be just so listing, well, look, in other situations I've dealt with, this is how it's been resolved. So it's important to ensure that you remain distant, unless the client has specifically said, and you've covered this in the contracting stage, that at times they may want some suggestions or something of that nature. At which point, you might be saying, look, I have quite a lot of experience in this area. How valuable would it be for me to share some of that? And it's always phrased as a question, or should, in my opinion, should always be phrased as a question. Because the client might turn around and say, yeah, that would be, that would be valuable. Or they may turn around and say, no, I don't want my own judgment to be clouded by, by other things. Both of which is fine. And one of the things with that, especially if you've got a lot of experience, is to be careful that you don't ask questions that guide a client towards that answer. Which, if you're good with questions, is easily done, and you can turn what seems like a quite polite question, such as how beneficial would it be to you to do a to-do list, for the client to go, oh, that sounds really beneficial. But if the client is in the previous conversation, has never mentioned a to-do list, time management, being organized, then you're essentially giving a client something to do that they haven't thought about. It might be useful, but it might not. So it's very much about making sure that that you don't try to implant something that wasn't really there. So when you get to those to those options, and if they are struggling, and if you genuinely 100% thought a to-do list would be beneficial for this client, and they've got the personality to do it, and they've got the time to do it, etc., etc., etc. Which, again, if you've done the other part correctly, you should know. But if there's that element of doubt, you might just want to phrase it again as, I do have some experience in this area that I can share, especially around things like your organizational methods, such as to-do lists. How beneficial would that be? Oh yeah, that would be useful, and then you can have that conversation. But I stress, you need to have had that conversation way back in the the intake session, initial contracting session, to agree with your client that, look, I've got a lot of experience in a lot of different areas. How much of that do you want me to share with you? And a lot of the clients that I've tended to work with, in fairness, most of them tend to be corporate, but they 9 times out of 10 will turn around and say, oh yeah, that'll be extremely useful. Mm-hmm. But some of them don't. Some of them are very it's important for me to find my own way with this. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you have to challenge them on that. When it becomes quite apparent that they can't. Mm-hmm. And that is, and again, so it's something that comes up right at the beginning, and it links to options quite a bit. It links to the actions and accountability that will come on in the last 2 sessions a lot more. But right at the outset, and it's a strange thing to think about, but within a lot of coaching models, one of the things that is not checked as often as it should be, and this is in my humble opinion, is, does the client actually have the skill, knowledge, and ability or capability to do the thing that they're trying to do? Because if they don't, then when you get to options, it's all going to be mute, because it's going to be, oh, well, I can write a thesis. All right, do you have the capability to do that? No. Right, okay, fair enough. And one of the things within that is, if you know up front, or in the reality bit, you've probed that, right? Do you have the ability to do that? Do you have the capability? Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the experience? Yeah, I've got all of that. When you get to the options, the things that they start talking about should connect. But if they haven't, then you need to be challenging the client on how they're going to get that skill, knowledge, and ability, or, and this is an absolutely key question, and for all of those who are listening, I'm going to emphasize this. There is a question that rarely gets asked in the assessment process, and it's useful for options, and it's essentially key, so for the following 2 sections, and it is, who can support you in this? Because if you ask the question about who can support you, you're asking a double-edged question. One of them is to identify who can support them, in which case you can then go on to talk about the right, what are you going to talk to these people about, when you're going to do it, and so on and so forth. And it identifies that the client has got a support network which forms part of their options. If the client, on the other hand, turns around and goes, I don't have anyone who can support me, then the options that you're looking at are the client's ability to be self-sufficient. And they are 2 completely different routes that somebody can go down. And consequently, the questions are slightly different as well. And it's just something to bear in mind, and especially for those of you who might later on be thinking about senior and master level, that the client themselves has a direct relationship with you as the coach, but you're not the panacea to everything. And certainly, as Dawn was saying, if you've got no knowledge whatsoever about what the client's talking about, and the sidebar that I would put with that is that I'm a firm believer that you should know the client's language. But once they start getting into options, is that ability to understand, right? Are they going to be doing this on their own, or is there somebody around them who can help? And an example of that would be who can support you? Yeah, I've got colleagues at work who can support you. Great. Don't leave it there. okay, the colleagues at work can support you in what way? Can they support you? Because until you actually go and ask the colleagues at work, who who all may turn around and go, no, we've never liked you anyway. Or may turn around and go, yeah, absolutely, boss. You don't know. So it's always that sort of building on these options. And there's the other thing within the options as well is touching on, again, it comes up more in the sort of the action points and accountability section. So I'm mindful of not going into it in too much detail. But you really want to be considering at this point the things that might get in the way. And the reason that I raise that is that when you've gone through the reality part, when you've talked about, well, what have you done so far? How well has that worked? In what ways has it not worked the way that you wanted it to? Assuming that they've done anything about it, because some people might come to coaching and have not done anything. This is literally their first, stab at something. The sort of the wedding dress immediately springs to mind. But if they have done something, if they've started and haven't done so well on it, you really want to be starting to chisel away at some of those. Okay, so what are the things that have got in the way, up to now, and just start to explore some of those, because when you get onto options, if those things that got in the way before haven't been dealt with, the likelihood is they're going to get in the way again. So within those options, you still have that question around, okay, so these are some great options, which one's going to get you closer to your goal, etc., etc., etc. But you've also got within that, okay, you're like out of those options, which ones could have the greatest impact with regards to things that might stop you. That was a badly phrased question, but it just sort of popped out. But something like that, that's really going to start to say, well, okay, so here are your options, but what about the things that might get in the way, and which ones are going to fit, which ones aren't.
And you've covered quite a lot of material there, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit, if I may, David. I'd like to build on the who question, especially if somebody is on their own or doesn't have what I call a dream team around them. I would always say, who else apart from me can help you achieve this? Because if they are on their own, they might just say, well, that's what I've come to coaching for. So saying who else by definition implies that you're in their dream team, but who else is going to be in your dream team that's going to help you make this happen? And I find that just that little extra word makes quite a big difference. I don't know, what do you think? Yeah,
totally agree. And so another sort of, unfortunately, so it does have the what question in it, but what's your support network like? Who else can support you in this? And again, all of those subtle words that that we've talked about at this point, who can support you is a totally different question to who else is in your dream team is a totally different question to who else can challenge you on this, who else can push you on this, who else can ensure that you achieve this, and all of that, and as you say, so if somebody turns around and says, well, it's really just the two of us, I nearly burst into song there. It is very much the, okay, so how self-resilient do you need to be in order to to do this? Because one of the things that is also worth considering, just before you go back on the other areas, is that like everything, so we all talk about I can multitask, and in fairness, the best that most people can get multitasking is walking, breathing, looking in the right direction, and answering their phone. Maybe carrying some shopping as well. Once you get into, so like coaching somebody and they're starting to go through the right, I'm going to do all of these different things. One of the things to take into consideration is if they're doing that, they're not doing something else. So the sort of the time element, or like, okay, so like if you're going to spend time doing this, like what's gonna, like what has to give way, and this is where the like who can support you, is really important, because it's a bit like saying, well, look, like if you're doing that, who else can do the stuff that that you would normally be doing? It's very prevalent. So like if you work with people in any sort of commercial environment, so if they're going to start doing something, who can they delegate their day-to-day stuff to? But also if like if you've got just going back to the wedding theme, like if you've got somebody who's planning a wedding, like who else can take some of the load? Like how many people have you got around you who can help you with this? And it's the ability to listen, because if earlier on in that conversation they've said, you're like me and the girls, or you're like me and the lads are going to do like XYZ, they've already mentioned it, so you can go back, you can go back to that and say, look, you're like, you mentioned earlier on that there was there was a group of you, so you're like, who out of that can help you with this?
Yes.
Who can like take some of the load so that you can concentrate on the the really important stuff? And if you can get to that, and I'm just picking up on the word that you used about like interrogation. If you can get into that conversational style of like where you're, I think so like coactive coaching. Might have mentioned this before. Have the so like the dance and the rhythm. That you're both at that same like same pace. You both know where you're going, and you both got that same amount of energy. Then it becomes right. Okay, so you're like, so who's going to help you with this? Oh yeah, I can get like Bob, Joe, Stephen, Sandra, and Pavel. You like to help me with this? Great. Like when are you going to do that? And that's when you get this interchange between your options. So like you're like starting to like take form, because until they take form, that's all they are. They're just options. They're just different things that you could do. And if I may prevail, because I was thinking about this when I was out as well, about what sort of metaphor could I use for this? And the encouragement would be to think, if you were Goldilocks, which is a sort of metaphor I've been using quite a lot lately. You're sort of your Goldilocks. You're trundling through the forest. You come to the house. The house of the three bears. And the gate is open, and you then said, right, what are my options for getting into the house? And you said, right, what are they? So the invitation for anybody who's listening to this live, or anybody who's listening to the recording, is pause at this point and just think, right, how could I get in? If it wasn't the front door, which is one option, how else could I get into that house? And that's all they are at that point. And then the thing to think about is that once you've got your your list of options, your list of options is only based upon the view that you've got at that moment in time. So if you're at the garden gate, thinking about a nice detached house, you're viewing your options as just looking straight forward. But what if the first thing that you did was walk the perimeter? So you think about your options first of all, and then you walk around the house. How many more options might you find by looking at it from different perspectives? So that ability to engage the client in thinking about their options, and then engage them to think, right, what about other perspectives? What might other people see? If you were looking at this from from above, from the side, how does it change? And then you've got the right, you originally had 4 options, now you've got 8 or 10 options. And that allows you then to to really work with the client around, oh, there are some things there that I hadn't really thought about.
Lovely. I mean, that's why it's important that we understand very quickly the language that our clients use, so that we can talk in metaphors, pictures, and so on, to really engage with them. So going back to self-disclosing, so somebody is stuck, they say, I don't know, and what I often hear is that the first sign of I don't know, a new practitioner is trying to be very helpful, because at this stage they're more than halfway through a 30-minute call. They know they want to get a result, so they can't help but self-disclose and offer advice or lead or whatever. Which, as we know, if you have, especially if you haven't dealt with it in the contracting stage, you haven't got permission, and then it goes wrong, who gets the blame? And it damages rapport for future sessions. But what would be some of the ways that you think, when a client says, I don't know, what do you think? How would you not fall into that trap, David?
I don't fall into that trap, because I did some work with Samaritans quite some while ago, and they were drilled in. So one of the things that was drilled in, especially when you're dealing with people who have some very strong emotional stuff going on. And they do have a tendency to say, what do you think I would, what do you think I should do? What would you do, and things like that. And I have a pretty much stock answer, which is, it's not about me, it's about you.
Yeah.
And and the way that I would deal with something, and the way that some of my other clients would deal with something, might be exactly the same as the way that you'll deal with it, but the result might be completely different. So it's important that that we work together and find what's going to be the best result for you. Now, I might tag that on with I do have some experience, I do have some suggestions, I can go through them with you, but we need to understand that if I do that, they're not suggestions per se. It's not advice, it's a description of what other people have done and what has happened, but we can use that as a framework if necessary, to help start going forward. You need to be, in my opinion, you need to be really careful, because some clients are quite happy with non-directive coaching. What most people would say, well, all coaching is non-directive coaching. But in the book Adaptive Coaching, and for the life of me I can't remember who the authors are, but it's simply called Adaptive Coaching. They make a reference in there, and again it comes back to contracting, as most things do, that some clients might want non-directive coaching, but some others at some point, not necessarily all the time, but at some point might want directive coaching or mentoring or training or support or guidance or advice or referrals or recommendations. And that if your role is to help the client get from wherever they are to wherever they want to get to, and you are competent and capable in those areas, then who's to say that providing you're happy to work like that, that you wouldn't work with a client in that manner. But, and it's a big but with all capitals really, and an exclamation mark, you have to have dealt with that in contracting. You don't want to be just suddenly turning around and going, well, if I was you, what I would do. And there used to be a counselling training video by a company called Video Arts, which was John Cleese's company, that I don't know if it's still going, but they used to produce lots and lots of different training videos, and all of the sort of key comedians from the BBC were in them. Anyway, the counselling one, sort of had a little outtake bit that used to come up every now and again, throughout the video, and it was simply, let me give you some advice based on my experience. Do not give people advice based on your experience, because the thing is, your experience, is not their experience. And as a colleague of mine is very, very fond of saying, nobody knows what it's like to live in your skin. And so if you look at assessments, like for example, and you've got introversion and extroversion, just as one of the scales. The danger with a lot of things, just sidetracking just very quickly, is that like you pigeonhole people into, oh, they're an extrovert or they're an introvert. But you can have the same person with the same profile, who will respond in different ways, because just because they're X or Y doesn't mean that they are every X or Y. So going back to that question, it is like very much, and to be fair, you should pick up a sense of the client really struggling pretty early on, because if it's not going well and they don't know what to do, that reality stage, the energy is just going to be going down. Very few people are going to be going, every time I've tried this, I've failed. Okay, I've lost money, I've lost my reputation, I've lost my self-esteem, I've lost my self-confidence. I tell you, nothing, absolutely nothing could be worse in my entire life. It just, people, well, there might be one person out there like that, but generally speaking, like when you're going through it, that energy level is going to be, is going to be pretty low. So in those cases, you might be really trying to hone in on that. Okay, so what is the one thing, the singular one thing that would make a difference to you right now, in this moment at this time. There is for those of you who like motivational talks, there is one by Dwayne Johnson on YouTube. Lots of motivational talks on YouTube, and Dwayne Johnson talks about his sort of backstory and how he ended up getting to where he is now. That's Dwayne Johnson, aka The Rock, for those of you who don't know. And one of the things that that he talks about within one of his motivational videos is that thing about in this moment, at this moment in time, not tomorrow, not later on. So if you were thinking about options, at this moment in time, now, here, what is the option that would make your life better, that would help you with the situation, that would change something, maybe not everything, but would just be that little bit of that key change. And then unfortunately it is very much then about it depends then what the client says. It depends upon where you go, because if you do have somebody that you get that at this point you get that sense of, you know what, I'm not sure if counseling is right for this person, that is the point that you might be thinking about referring them to the counselor. Because if something is really deep and buried, it's if it hasn't come out in the reality section, it's gonna come out now in the options section.
And that's absolutely crucial when somebody is overwhelmed, to bring it down to one minute thing that will get them moving towards whatever the big thing is.
Yeah, and I think the one other thing that I would just add, and it's come up in conversation when I've been doing some feedback sessions with people, is that in an ideal world, so we've got a client, we've contracted for 4, 6, 8, 12 sessions, whatever it might be, and everything is is running smoothly, because let's remember that options might come up in every session that we do, and it might be a continuation of the the same topic. So going back to the wedding dress, that might be a continuation of how to look good in the wedding dress. Or it might be different topics each time. But when you ask that opening question, how are things going, or how are you, or or whatever it might be, that is really the only question that you can be absolutely certain, other than, so what do you want to talk about today, of asking. And you might have a client that has been quite energetic, full of enthusiasm and everything else, but stuff happens. Life gets in the way in between coaching sessions. So you might be there looking, think, right, who have I got next? Oh, I've got Joe, or I've got Sandra next. Great. They're always up for the coaching session. But then when you see how are things, and they go, oh, yeah, and you just get that sense of, right, something's happened. So if I used a personal example, as Dawn knows, if somebody called me yesterday, they would not have got the sort of reasonably energetic normal me, because I had major IT problems. My PC and everything else was sort of in the shop, and I was just disconnected. Literally, I was literally disconnected from the internet, and in my own head I was disconnected as well. And they would have just got, oh yeah, hi David, how are you today? Oh, interesting that you ask. And then they would have got probably 35 minutes of me ranting and saying it's like being back in the Stone Ages. So you don't know, what's up. So it's almost like a little bit of a cautionary tale that not to always expect doom, gloom, and despondency, but also not to expect that they're always going to be themselves. It's a sort of just expect whatever you get. So that if somebody turns around and says things haven't been so good, then your conversation might go that way. And if it's about that, then sometimes you don't want to be trying to get lots and lots of options out. If somebody's dealing with something that's that's really, really bad. So it's just that it's that cautionary tale of there's not an exact number that you want to be looking. It's not the more the merrier. It's the does the option fit with what they're dealing with right now?
And there's no harm in asking them. In order for this to be a productive and satisfactory session for you, how many options would you like to come away with? They might say, I only want one, the killer one, or 3 or 4. And then at least if you've only got one and they want 3 or 4, how much work you as the coach have got to keep doing in terms of asking the right questions. So just ask them. Don't try and coach with one arm behind your back. You have to find out.
Yeah, and it's and I think you're absolutely right. And the supermarket metaphor, is almost the other one, which is the one that I often use is once upon a time when you went looking for dog food, there was one tin, and that was it, and it was one make, one tin, 2 or 3 flavors. Now you've got an entire aisle of dog food, and you're walking up and down going, well, I'm sure when they were wild, they weren't picking off pheasant with peas and carrots. What do I buy them? And I've had that conversation with people in the supermarket aisle. So sometimes too much choice can be confusing.
Going back to the question which comes up on, I don't know, what would you do? What I've heard when I'm assessing people is quite often they will ignore it and just ask another who, what, where, when, how question. My suggestion would be don't ignore it, because they'll just keep asking. They'll think you haven't heard it. So thank them for the question. And so you need to acknowledge it and just say you don't want to influence the brainstorming session that you're about to enter into. But as you said before, David, we don't want to have people who are struggling and genuinely stuck. But most people are pretty lazy, and that's the same for coaches. They will always take the easy option if they can get away with it. So don't give up the minute your client says, I don't know, I'm stuck, and go straight into sharing and self-disclosing and suggesting and leading. No, you become a better coach. You step up and you ask better quality open questions that stretches the client. So if we then move on to rules of brainstorming, just remind us, David, so that when coaches go down that route, I don't want to influence you, we're just about to brainstorm so that you get your good one killer option or your 3 or 4 options. What are the rules of brainstorming?
The rules of brainstorming are so like nothing's nothing's ridiculous, because you can the sifting process comes afterwards. So it's a bit like, right, just anything that comes to mind, what could it be? And then as you say, so when you get to that that magic number, and don't judge, don't judge what people come out with, and encourage the client not to judge as well. So typical exercises that you generally how many uses of a plant pot can you come up with? How many uses for a paper clip? They tend to come up in a lot of books on creativity. It's exactly the same for this, right? Thinking about the conversation that we've had, how, and you can challenge the client and say, right, okay, you didn't say that you had a set number of options that you wanted, so let's see how many you can come up with.
Yeah, and I praise them as well, because it's like when you're teaching a child or a puppy, if you praise people, they think, oh, okay, it reinforces that it's a safe, non-judgmental space. But if you just go, okay, what else? It's like, oh, well, perhaps that answer was wrong. I'll try and think of something else. And immediately the client will feel a little bit squashed. So give praise, but it's got to be genuine, meaningful, and tailored. So it's a building question, so well done. How could you make that even better, or whatever? You don't just say fantastic, sounds great, because it doesn't matter what it sounds like to you, but using building questions that incorporate praise, that makes the person feel even more creative.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add to that as well is that if they come out with an option that you think is the worst option that they could ever have come out with, don't respond, and certainly catch your mouth before it goes, what, really?
Yeah.
Because it's not for you to say there, because what won't work for you might be the best thing that they could possibly do.
And that's a question I hear a lot, David. It doesn't necessarily have the, oh wow, really, but the question that comes up is, how realistic is that? And I tend to think even just asking that question throws doubt into the client's mind that, oh, well, maybe it's not realistic. So how would you help the client prioritize their brainstorming options into something that is realistic without actually sounding like you're challenging them?
If I had enough time, and I know sort of for practitioners, there isn't a massive amount, but if I had enough time, I would do something like a forced analysis, which is okay. So if let's say you've got 5 options, and we've agreed that all of these options are beneficial in either progress or achieving the desired outcome, and that's the key. That's just okay, before we decide which of your options that you're going to do are the ones that you're going to do, let's just refer back to the overall goal and just make sure that they fit. Okay, so if you look at these options in the order that you've got, first and foremost, I might say, right, if you had to prioritize them, honestly, as 1 to 5, or I might even say just 1 to 3, how would you do that? And then once they've done it, I'd be curious at that point and say, okay, so so what is it about that one that seems to be more important than the other one? If there was more time, I would just do a simple as I say, force analysis. Okay, so looking at number 1, is number 1 a better option than number 2? Yes, it's a better option. Okay, is number 1 a better option than number 3? No. Right. Is number 3 a better option than number 2? Yes. Arguably, it has to be, because if number 1's better than number 2, but not better than number 3, number 3 has to be. And that just starts moving them up. Now, the thing with that, and the thing with helping people to prioritize their options, don't be frightened to ask the question, on what basis are you prioritizing? Because priorities can be speed, ease, getting it out of the way, and what you're looking for within that is that, look, when you're aiming to achieve your desired outcome, it's not about the speed of of doing an option, and it's not about the ease of doing an option. It's about taking responsibility to work on the option that is going to get you to the desired outcome. And it goes back to what you were saying, Dawn, about people being naturally lazy, because if you're coming up with a lot of options, no matter who you are, at the back of your mind is, if I come up with a lot of options, I'm going to have to do these things, aren't I? Otherwise my coach is going to be on my case the next time we meet. To which the answer to that is, yeah, probably probably will be. So like those options, it's the don't be frightened to challenge them, if you've got the time, without interrogating, but like certainly the okay, so what is it about that option that's more beneficial, and and use whatever the goal is, like go back to that language, reinforce that language, so that goal, how does that option, help you to achieve what you want to do, so like in your wedding dress, because then they've got the it means like X, Y, Z. Okay, great. Is there anything? And again, as you were saying, rather than doing the and what else can you do?
Yeah.
Once you've got that, think about it almost as a like a chain. So rather than what else being a almost a separate line, how can you link that and go, okay, that's as you were saying, that's a great option that you've come out with. Of your other options, which one would support that and help you to get that little bit further? Oh, well, if I did this as well, and then they're sort of creating their own chain, rather than having like a group of sort of separate things to do that that lack a little degree of sort of connectivity.
Agreed. And of course we need to help the client chunk down their goal as well, instead of challenging them about is that realistic. So if I think about myself, when I said when I hit 50 I wanted to run a marathon, and I had been a couch potato all my life, I'd never done anything, a coach probably could have rightly thought, wow, is that realistic? But instead of saying that, you say, great, okay, so let's chunk this marathon down. When is it going to happen? So we've got X, and you work backwards. How many weeks or months have you got? And when you step out the door for the first time in your brand new trainers, how far do you need to run to feel that you've made progress? And then the week after, how much, and so on. So you can accept the most unrealistic option at face value, but just work backwards by chunking it down. And then, because as you say, we're not to judge whether something is unrealistic or not, but if we can help them do that, then, and by working backwards, they can see for themselves the timeline isn't realistic, and so they alter it themselves. So it fits in with empowering the client. I think the other thing to remember, if I can continue, is about the results. Coaches tend to be very results orientated, David, and what I hear people in assessment saying, and what does it take for you to be a 10? Well, of course, not everybody wants to be a 10. Just because we think in terms of, achieving top levels, it's about, well, where are you now on the scale of 1 to 10? And if they're a 3 or a 1 or whatever, fantastic, you're on the scale, that's absolutely fine. Where would you ideally like to be? I'd be happy with a 5 or happy with a 6. Just accept that. Don't feel you've got to keep pushing them to be a 10. It's about them, not you.
Yeah, and I think just because you've raised scaling questions, because it's one of the things that does come up from time to time. If you're using a scaling question, and I totally agree, I would always encourage you use one up front. So the where are you now on whatever scale, like commitment, determination, like whatever it might be, and you might then want to say, so where do you want, by the end of this session, where would you like to get to, or ultimately where would you like to get to? If you're going to use another one to sort of judge how progress has been made in the session, use it around the reality point, because if you use it too late in the session, so let's say, for example, you do ask the question on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you now? And somebody goes 6. And you've got all of those, other questions about, okay, you're a 6. You're like, what would it take to make? So you haven't got time to deal with any of that. Exactly. So I would always encourage scaling questions, to end at the 3/4 mark, because you should, you know, if you get to the end of a session, you should really know, and experience will tell you this, you should really know whether a client's motivated to do, you know, what they're going to go away and do. You shouldn't really need to ask them.
And if you do ask, I think it's a sign that you don't feel like you've delivered what you set out to, and therefore you're looking for reassurance from your client who's paying you.
Yeah.
So we've come to the end of our time, and you know, normally we do these sessions with a special guest speaker, but ours wasn't able to pitch up today, and we've managed to fill an hour and 5 minutes, just the two of us, and there's still some things on my list. So I know that there's more, but we'll save it for the next session at the end of next month, when we come to really nailing down the options in terms of when you're going to do it and prioritizing the exact steps. So thank you as always, David, for sharing so much good stuff with us around what you're looking for when you're assessing practitioners at whatever level they're at. Any questions from listeners, because we've run out of time, just send them into David or I, or use the contact sheet on the website, and we will get back to you. But thank you, everybody, and thank you, David.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone. Continue to take care and stay safe wherever you are.